Hi, I'm Jeff Ginter with Real Progressives. Thanks for joining us every Monday for MMT Mondays, where we rebroadcast interviews and lectures and presentations from actual MMT economists, experts, economic experts, people who really know what they're talking about and have information that we all desperately need to be able to get our heads around and have some type of command over, so that when we go to our elected officials who have historically been telling us, well, it would be wonderful to give you Medicare for all. Of course, I believe in it, but it's politically impossible. Why is it politically impossible? Because for 40 plus years, politicians, pundits, and oligarchs have been telling us all that it's too expensive. So people believe it. People have conflated, because they've been told to, household spending from government spending. If you tell people that the government is just like a household and needs to raise revenue or borrow before it can afford to do anything, people will believe that when they're told by their leaders, by people on the news, from economic experts. It takes a mountain of effort to be able to do that, and they played the long game. The problem is that we're out of time. We don't have the time to play the long game to get people to put aside that. We need to wake people up. Hello, the federal government creates the currency. It can't possibly need it back in the form of taxation as a source of revenue. There are reasons that they have to tax. If they don't tax, the economy goes away. There is no more currency. So there are reasons to tax, and you need to understand why that is. Because we can no longer gently, quietly, calmly, nicely accept from our politicians, from our pundits, from people who should know better, that we can't afford these things. We're out of time. The climate is not waiting for us. People are dying right now through healthcare issues that should not exist because they've been financialized. To a sovereign government with a sovereign currency, the only thing that matters is resources. Do we have them? Can we marshal them? To what use and to what purpose shall we utilize them? It's not about taxpayer money. Taxpayer money is not utilized as a source of revenue. So tonight we have Stephen Hail. He's a guest lecturer at the University of Adelaide, a brilliant man, wonderful speaker. He's going to explain to us all what modern monetary theory is. What is currency to a monetary sovereign like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom? What is money? What is currency? He's going to explain all of that. And hopefully by the end, will it be that much closer to understanding how the economy works. We'll be back at the end. Talk to you soon.
Well, thanks very much, Phil, and thanks very much to everybody for coming. I very much appreciate it. Phil mentioned Keynes, and one of Keynes' famous quotes was that the difficulty lies not in accepting new ideas, but in escaping from old ones. And what I want to offer you today is what, for many of us, will be a new frame for thinking about government spending and the government budget. For some people, you might find your natural reaction to some of the things that I'm going to say will be a mix of disbelief and sometimes moral anger. Sometimes when I do teach these ideas in all three universities in South Australia, there's one or two people that have heard me explain them before here. Sometimes I get the reaction from people where they come up to me and they say something along the lines of, how can I say that to my son? I had a student say this to me a couple of years ago. What sort of message is it for me to give my son that the government can just spend without constraint? And my reaction to that generally is that it's just a fact. I explain that your budget, your son's budget, has nothing at all in common with the budget of the Australian Commonwealth Government or the government of any other country which has a similar financial system to ours. But if you have those sensations yourself, those feelings yourself, as you listen to me this evening, then don't feel bad about it, because that was exactly my reaction to this. I had just the same problems that you might find yourself having when it comes to escaping from ideas which have been inculcated in us for many, many years, and metaphors which we've become very, very used to, where we equate the government budget with a household budget, or maybe the budget of a business organisation, when they have nothing whatsoever in common. Now, I heard a very intelligent, very committed, and this person may even be here now because it's a South Australian progressive, it's not Mark, but a progressive politician being interviewed on news radio yesterday morning. And actually, what can you put over in a radio interview? They crucify you if you pursue these arguments, given that you have only a minute or two to react to whatever the interviewer has to say. But the interviewer said, word for word, I typed it out, almost as they were having a conversation. Do you accept the government can only spend what it earns? And the interviewee said, of course I accept the government can only spend what it earns. My reaction to that, and Phil's reaction to that, and the reaction of any modern monetary theorist to that, would generally speaking be to turn the radio off. And I'd be tempted to kick the cat almost, were it not for the fact that I love cats. And it's the wrong language. The government, the Commonwealth Government, doesn't earn anything. In a sense, it neither has nor doesn't have money, as we're going to discover. But it certainly doesn't earn anything. The government's taxes are not what the government earns. Neither is it the case that it is the role of taxation in a modern financial system to, in some sense, pay for government spending. That's one of the messages that I got for you this evening. It's the wrong language. It's the wrong metaphor. It buys into the neoliberal metaphor of the government as though it was a business that had to make a profit, or as though it was a household that had to earn money to pay for its spending now, or if it spends more than it earns now, needs to earn the money in future years to pay back its debt. Technically, actually, if the Australian government ever paid back all of its financial liabilities, we would have no financial system. There would be no money. I'm not even sure what it means for the government to pay back all of its debts. It's almost a meaningless thing to say. And you get all the wrong inferences from it. Even if you are a progressive politician, you're on the back foot already. You're using the language and the metaphors of the neoliberals, and you're kind of accepting the idea that governments on average over time have to balance their budgets. I'm going to show you in a few minutes that that's never been true. Nearly all governments, nearly all the time, throughout modern economic history, have not balanced their budgets. The Australian Commonwealth Government has nearly always run a budget deficit. In the case of the US, you could take the word nearly out, apart from a few years under Bill Clinton. They've always run a budget deficit. The same thing is true in the UK. The same thing is true in most countries, even hard-working countries like Germany, as I'm going to show you. Our government is a monetary sovereign. It's a currency-issuing central government, and moreover, we're not on a gold standard. We haven't been on a fixed exchange rate since 1983. We have no commitment to exchange our currency at a fixed rate for any real asset or anything which has a fixed value. And that gives our government a freedom of policy space which is not available, for example, to Eurozone governments, countries which have foolishly signed away their monetary sovereignty, signed away a lot of their policy space, as recent experience tells us. So here's the take-home message. This is what we're going to get to at the end, but I thought I'd say it at the beginning. Cuts certainly aren't necessary right now. Neither do we need a higher overall tax burden. There may be many reasons why you might think that some taxes ought to be higher than they are at the moment. There are good reasons why the mining companies ought to be paying more tax, for example. But the idea that it's necessary for the government to be able to pay for those public services we need, or those investments we need, is simply not true. It's fallacious. The government deficit, I'm going to show you, ought to be, almost certainly, significantly higher than it is right now. Even that term budget deficit is misleading. The word budget buys into the metaphor of the government as a household. And the word deficit, of course, deficit means a shortfall. Something's lacking. Surplus is naturally good, deficit is naturally bad. It would be better to talk about a government net injection into the economy than a budget deficit. But I'm so used to using the neoliberal language myself, I am going to be talking about government deficits and budget deficits with you this evening. A government budget deficit in no sense burdens future generations of Australians. The Australian government had something like 7 or 8 times as much debt at the end of the Second World War as it does now. Some of you, I guess, are perhaps more senior than me in years. Maybe you grew up during the 1950s, 60s, you're young adults in the 70s. Did you feel that you were under a terrible burden because of the enormous Australian government debt which existed in the 1940s and 50s? I don't think so. It's a myth. We can afford full employment if we can develop the institutions which are necessary to deliver it without inflation taking off. Our government, the Australian government, as long as it doesn't borrow in foreign currency, as long as we don't join a fixed exchange rate system, as long as we don't, and we'd probably have been foolish enough if they let us, join the Eurozone, can't ever go bust. This is not a theory, although it's often discussed under the heading modern monetary theory, which makes it sound really complicated. It's just a simple fact. The constraints on what the government can spend, the constraints on what we can all spend, are inflation, and also, of course, the total amount of goods and services which we consume without destroying our environment, which kind of depends on what types of goods and services we consume and how we choose to produce them. Money isn't something we're short of. Now, I just wanted to make the point that this is a massively exploding area of interest in macroeconomics. In recent years, there have been many academic papers published and many important books published by not just lefty academics like Phil, but very famous international academic Randall Wray's a very famous American economist. Warren Mosler is a multi-millionaire fund manager. He's hardly a lefty. His book's freely available online. I can give you a link to it. The guy over on the right-hand side has written more or less exactly what I'm going to say to you in the next few minutes. Frank Newman, he was Deputy Treasury Secretary in the US in the 1990s. These people are insiders. Warren Mosler was a central banking insider. Frank Newman was a Treasury insider. These are not kooky ideas. They're not even a theory, really. It's just a set of facts. That's all I've got to share with you. These people are not deficit hawks. We've all heard deficit hawks. They generally speaking right for the Australian or on the right of the Liberal Party, and their ideas about government budgets are probably 100 years out. I'm not really going to worry about them. We're just going to dismiss their ideas out of hand. Most of the people that you hear from, well, Malcolm Turnbull leftwards, really, are deficit doves. We only get the choice in this country normally. It's really frustrating between deficit hawks and deficit doves. And the deficit doves are the people who say, yes, the government, of course, the government on average has to balance its budget just like your household does. But households borrow money sometimes. Businesses borrow money sometimes. They make a profit. Other times, These are the deficit doves. They're no more correct, and they're nicer on the whole. They're a bit more realistic and they do less damage. But they're no more correct than the deficit hawks are. Owls can see in the dark. A very prominent modern monetary theorist called Stephanie Kelton started using this term, deficit owl. There is nothing particularly good or bad about any particular level of Commonwealth government budget deficit, or perhaps even under some circumstances rarely surplus. You have to judge it in the context of the economy as a whole and the excess capacity we have to produce goods and services in the economy, the level of unemployment and underemployment and insecure employment. But the idea that the government needs to balance its budget over time, otherwise it will go bust, is a nonsense. It's always been nonsense, really. It's particularly nonsense in a country like Australia since 1983, from 1983 onwards. And indeed, the other message is that government budgets are not only normally in deficit. In Australia and in every country in the world, this is true, except for a few oil-rich countries with relatively small populations. Some of the Gulf states. Norway is another example of countries which have on average run government budget surpluses. Everywhere else, the budget is nearly always in deficit. And this is a good thing for a variety of reasons. Now, the myth, where does it come from? This is a picture that a modern money theory guy who's actually originally an architect put together, and there's another slightly more complicated picture coming up. This is the myth. The idea that the private sector from somewhere has got a little bit of money, but not much, and the government's stealing all this money, stealing the private sector's money in taxes or borrowing the money. China's got loads of money. By the way, the Chinese government runs budget deficits nearly every year as well. China's supposed to have loads of money, and this is for the US federal government, the Commonwealth government. They're absorbing all this money, and they're wasting it all on entitlements, paying out all the money to lazy people. Some of it they're finding other imaginative ways to waste. The rest is being repaid because of all the borrowing that's happened in the past, or being paid out in interest, and the private sector is being bled dry. That's how most people think of the government budget in Australia. It's profoundly, distressingly wrong. We'll come to the second picture in a moment. Even if you buy into this way of looking at the world, I have to throw a few charts at you because otherwise you might think I'm making this up. But don't worry too much about the charts. I'm not particularly worried about the difference between government net debt and gross debt. Net debt is basically what you owe minus what you've got in the bank, give or take a few complications. Our government has virtually no net debt, but to someone like me that's irrelevant anyway. Before the recent budget, the government's net debt was expected to peak at a level, about a bit more than a quarter of Germany's current net debt relative to the size of its economy. And with current budget settings, how many years was it going to take us to catch them up? An infinite number of years. But anyway, like I said, to me that's kind of irrelevant. I don't like this year's budget balance for Australia, so we've got last year's here. I don't like this year's because it's been fiddled. Did you notice several months ago, the announcement that there was going to be a transfer from the Commonwealth Government to the Reserve Bank, transfer of reserves to the one institution in the country that doesn't need reserves because it's the currency issuer. The Reserve Bank does need, perhaps, foreign currency reserves, but you can't get that from the Commonwealth Government. And that's not what's being transferred over. It was just a way of bumping up the budget deficit so they could say how terrible the budget deficit was and reduce it again. At least that's what I think it was. Glenn Stevens, the governor of the Reserve Bank, was asked about this, and he said, well, no, we don't really need it. That's more or less what he said. But people kind of like to see these reserves in our accounts. Nonsense. Anyway, This was a fair measure, if you thought it was important, of the budget balance for the previous financial year, and you can see we're not exactly amongst the big borrowers, but again, I kind of don't think that's important, so to me, it's irrelevant. Japan has a big budget deficit and has for years. Good thing too, it's kept unemployment low in Japan. Is the Japanese government going to default on its debt? No, never. Why would it? I mean, if Standard & Poor's think the Japanese government's going to default on its yen-denominated debt when it owns the only institution that's allowed to print yen, then Standard & Poor's doesn't understand macroeconomics. Another chart, don't worry about this particularly, but this is the Australian Commonwealth government budget balance down the years. This is a chart from Professor Bill Mitchell, who is the leading Australian modern monetary theorist, and it just makes the point, you know, excluding the Howard Costello years, and the price of those surpluses was soaring household debt, as we're going to see if I don't spend too much time waffling. But generally speaking, you see most of the time the Australian government has run deficits, year after year, decade after decade, since the 1950s. Does the government need to get back to surplus? Well, it's hardly ever been in surplus. And where do these ideas come from? Has everybody forgotten? It's as though we used to understand the periodic table. If we take economics as chemistry, and we've kind of forgotten it and gone back to alchemy. Here's another chart, which I found somewhere. If you want long-term data on Australian government debt, we don't have net debt data, but we've got gross debt data. It doesn't really matter for our purposes, the difference. It's just a point I made earlier. Look, go back to about 1950, and Australian government securities issued were over 1.5 times our gross domestic product in a year. It's a bit more than 20% now. 7 or 8 times as much. If you're 60, 65, have you felt across your lifetime the enormous burden of paying interest? Interest on the government debt is actually stimulative in the economy. It's not coming out of taxpayers' money. Anyway, did you feel the burden? Did you feel the burden when there was free higher education introduced? Did you feel the burden when all those public services which hadn't existed before were provided? Did you feel the burden when the modern welfare state was being built, of the enormous debt in the late 1940s and early 1950s? It is true that Australia's government debt, however you measure it, and the Australian government budget deficit is very low compared to almost anybody else in the world and compared to Australia's own history. It's true that our public spending on a variety of things, you just go to the OECD and you can see us compared with lots of other countries, and we spend relative to some countries apparently next to nothing on medical care, next to nothing on pensions, not very much on public education. It's not going to become unaffordable in the future. Actually, the word unaffordable is meaningless if you're the Commonwealth government. We can, as a country, spend too much, whether it's the private sector doing the spending or the government doing the spending. But to say the government spends too much, in what sense? The government is a currency issuing central government. It's a monetary sovereign. It's spending its own money. It doesn't need your money. You need the government's money. That's the way around in which monetary systems work. So all these things are true, but we need to dig a bit deeper. What did I mention about the Howard Costello years? And what's the problem with the Australian Treasury? The Australian Treasury at the moment is forecasting economic growth and the government budget balance for the next few years, which are literally impossible. Or at least I think so. We only managed to get Commonwealth budget surpluses during the Howard Costello years because over 25 years or so, but most of it happened under Howard and Costello, we trebled the amount of household debt we have. The issue in Australia is not government debt, it's private sector debt, and that's not business debt, it's household debt. Households aren't currency issuers. Households can become insolvent. We're the world champions. We didn't win the Football World Cup. We could win the World Cup of household debt in Australia. Whether you compare us, there we are. We've got Canada that we're often compared to. We've got those spendthrift Italians where their households relative to disposable income have less than half as much debt as ours. Britain overtook us for a while, just like the English won the Ashes for a while. They overtook us in the debt stakes, but because the UK government, even though it's not wanted to, has been running big budget deficits since the GFC, UK households have been able to pay back some of their debt. That hasn't happened. We've stopped borrowing more, but we haven't paid any of it back. And moreover, the current government is gambling on a repeat of the Howard and Costello years. We got too much debt already. Even with zero interest rates, there's a limit to the amount of debt households can ever take on, unless we have 200-year mortgages. To win the argument, progressive politicians, whether they're from the Greens or elsewhere, have to know that the Commonwealth government, whether they decide to say anything about this in an interview or not, they at least need to know the Commonwealth government budget is nothing like a household budget, nothing like the business, nothing like the state government budget either. The Commonwealth government faces ecological limits, of course, and limits due to shortages of what we can produce, our productive capacity. And actually, of course, what we need to do if we want to expand that productive capacity is to invest in things like skills and infrastructure and technology. The Commonwealth government faces no, as Phil was saying, no separate financial constraints at all. It can never become insolvent. Budget deficits in the future are inevitable. I knew Julia Gillard was going to lose her job as soon as she promised a budget surplus. Because I told one or two people who were here from Flinders at the time, because what I'm about to talk to you briefly about is going to show that actually this was just inconsistent with what was possible as far as the rest of the economy is concerned. In order for the Commonwealth government budget to be in surplus, it requires certain things to be true about Australia's financial relationship with the rest of the world and private sector budget, just because of the way the financial system works. And I just don't think it's possible in the near future, unless you fiddle the figures, and even then only temporarily, to have a budget surplus. You can cause a recession trying to have one. I'm going to be talking, there's various ways of defining money that economists use, and defining something called the money supply. What I'm going to be focusing on is the most fundamental definition of money, which is what economists call the monetary base, what I'll call government money. It exists in two forms, in the form of currency at issue, signed by not only the Governor of the Reserve Bank, but the senior public servant in the Treasury, in case you're unaware of whose liability this is. But it also exists in the form of the balances that our banks and other financial institutions have at the Reserve Bank. In other words, it exists in the form of electronic items on a big spreadsheet. Now, only the government and the Reserve Bank of Australia can create government money, can spend government money into existence. That's what happens when the government spends. It spends money into existence. This is the only form of money which is a net financial asset for the private sector. It's a safe asset for us. It's not a liability for us. It's not debt that you and I have to repay. It's been issued by the government. Alan Greenspan, that well-known socialist, this is a quote from him way back in the 90s, but he often said things like this, often when talking to not terribly well-educated politicians, you know, in congressional hearings and things. The government cannot become insolvent with respect to obligations in its own currency. Lots of times he said this because it's true.
Just just remind people who Alan Greenspan was.
He was the chairman of the Federal Reserve before last. I'm going to have a quote from the last chairman of the Federal Reserve in a moment as well, saying much the same thing. Anyway, I better keep going. Whose money is this, though? Can you print these notes? No. Can you, using keystrokes, spend government money into existence? No, it's not created in the private sector. It's created by the government. Actually, historically, governments invented money in the first place, but we haven't got time to get into ancient history now. Modern money is government money. It is created from nothing. It has a zero marginal cost. It's spent into existence by the central government or the central bank, which in this sense ought to be consolidated in to the central government. It's part of the central government. As I just said, it exists in the form of currency or bank reserves. There is... people often say banks create money when they lend to you. And they do create another form of money when they lend to you, but they don't create net financial assets when that happens. If a bank lends to you, you get a deposit in your account that you can spend, but you have a loan you need to repay. Only government money is a financial asset for the private sector and not a financial liability. So, there you go. Every dollar of Commonwealth government spending creates a dollar of money. Every dollar of taxation destroys a dollar of money. Government net spending, that's when the government spends more than it raises in taxation and other receipts, provides financial wealth to the private sector. Your and my spending doesn't. If I spend money in your shop, that's creating financial wealth for you. It's destroying it as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't create net financial wealth for the private sector. The important point is the government does not need to tax you to pay for its spending. The government does need to tax you, but it needs to tax you to destroy some of your ability to spend in order to create space in the economy for the government to provide the public services we want without there being what Phil called demand pull inflation. That's a very important distinction. That is the function of taxation in a modern financial system. It does need to tax you, but it doesn't need to tax you to pay for its spending. Why would it need its money from you? It creates the money. Anyway. Here, it's a bit more complicated, but here's J.D. Alt's proper description of a currency issuing central bank, of a financial system in a monetary sovereign. FG, federal government, Commonwealth government, okay? They're the ones that create the money. They've got the tap. When they spend, it, of course, creates a demand for goods and services, but it also puts financial wealth into the private sector. Indeed, interest payments on existing government debt, and by now you ought to be thinking, well, should we even use the word debt at all when we're talking about things like treasury bonds, is stimulative. And again, the interest doesn't come from you. Not in any meaningful sense. It's new money every time the government spends, even when the government pays out interest. It's increasing the supply of government money in the system. Now, of course, if there's too much money in the system, yes, there'd be too much spending. It would go beyond the productive capacity of the economy, and we'd have inflation, and so we have to withdraw some of that demand, again, in the form of taxation. But there's no necessary reason why the taxation and the government spending need to be in balance with each other. Normally they won't be. All this spending, of course, as is often forgotten by neoliberals, is providing us with the social and physical infrastructure on which our entire economy and profitable businesses are based, that we rely upon. Now, one question I haven't answered yet is, why does the government borrow money at all? Actually, they don't need to. I'd better tell you, I think I've put on the next slide, no, 2 slides time. Sleep now. I don't mean it. It's got something to do with interest rates. If the government net spends, then it's putting more cash into the banking system. Now, you're all familiar with the cash rate. You've all heard the cash rate, 2.5%. It's first Tuesday of every month. Some important people at the Reserve Bank discuss whether to put it up a bit or not, and generally speaking, in recent times, they leave it where it is, at a level which is a record low level for Australia, but which is still relatively high compared to other countries. What exactly is it? The way our economic system works, of course, we all know there are millions of transactions taking place each day, transferring funds from one bank to another. These transactions are cleared using the balances that the banks have, the government money that the banks hold at the central bank, at the Reserve Bank of Australia. And late in the afternoon every day, some of the banks know they're going to be short of cash tomorrow morning to settle up for today's transactions. Other banks know they've got too much cash, they hold more cash than they need, and so the banks with more cash than they need lend overnight, just for 24 hours, to the banks that are going to be short of cash tomorrow morning. This makes sure all the transactions can be cleared and our economic system continues to function. The rate of interest at which the banks lend to each other is called the cash rate. If the banking system is flooded with cash, the Reserve Bank loses control of the cash rate. Our Reserve Bank, remember, announces its target for the cash rate, and in recent years the banks have just followed the Reserve Bank's target. So we don't even use the term target cash rate anymore. We just say the cash rate is 2.5%. It's not a rate of interest at which the Reserve Bank lends to anyone. It's a rate of interest at which the private sector banks lend to each other. If there's too much cash in the banking system, the cash rate goes below the Reserve Bank's target. Government spending in excess of taxation puts more cash into the banking system. In order to withdraw that cash from the banking system again, and it doesn't matter who does this, it doesn't matter whether it's the Reserve Bank using the already existing government bonds which it owns, or whether it's the Treasury issuing new bonds. In order to withdraw this cash from the system, to allow the Reserve Bank still to control the cash rate, they sell new government bonds. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you they don't need to sell the government bonds to get their money from you. They create this money. It does tell you the way our system works at the moment. This is not the way that the American system works anymore, or the British system works anymore, or the New Zealand system works anymore, so it doesn't always have to be complicated like this. But the way the system works at the moment, they sell government bonds in order to maintain control over interest rates, or if you like, economics jargon. Sales of government bonds are not fiscal policy at all, they're monetary policy. They're about keeping control of interest rates. Don't take my word for it, though. This is from a few years ago, and maybe it's slightly out of context, but just every now and then public servants say things which are true and slightly surprising. Look, Gerald Dodson, Head of Treasury Services, Australian Office of Financial Management. Australian government treasury bonds, not issued for budget funding purposes. That's just what I was telling you. They don't need to borrow money to pay for their spending. They sell treasury bonds to withdraw cash from the banking system to retain control of interest rates. Not the same thing at all. So the government doesn't need to borrow its money from you. It does have a reason to issue debt, I've just said, given the current system for setting interest rates, but not to fund its spending. Government debt issuance is about interest rate management. I guarantee that our Treasurer does not understand this. I just told you a little bit about I don't mean to be mean. Most people don't understand this. Or not unnecessarily mean. A question: can our government run out of money, to use some words which I heard Tony Abbott say recently? No, of course not. How could you ever think that? And this is another term from Mr. Abbott. Has the government maxed out on its credit card? Well, it hardly has any debt anyway. Actually, Australian banks have been exempted from a requirement of the Bank for International Settlements relating to banks holding safe assets to hold a lot of government debt because there isn't enough government debt in Australia. Is it going to leave a burden for future generations? Were you burdened? There was 8 times as much debt then as there is now. Were you burdened? No, no. And the way to burden future generations is to destroy the ecosystem, or else not to train and educate people and not to invest in the physical infrastructure which we need to support our economy in the future. Monetary sovereign governments can spend too much money. You can create Zimbabwe, I suppose, if you like. Not going to happen, though. They can spend too much money, but they can never run out of money. The above does not apply, or not fully, and we haven't got time for me to explain in what sense it does and in what sense it doesn't. If you're not a monetary sovereign, South Australia, unless we declare independence from the rest of Australia, which wouldn't be such a good idea, and develop our own currency. South Australia is not a currency issuing monetary sovereign. Neither is Spain. They turned themselves into a state government, basically. Neither is Hong Kong, although they are kind of, because although Hong Kong has a fixed exchange rate against the US dollar, they have such massive reserves of US dollars that technically Hong Kong's never going to run out of US dollars either. If you have significant foreign currency debt, you can't ignore, or you can't be quite so, I would say ignore, you can't be quite so relaxed about the exchange rate as we can be in Australia. But in countries like Australia, so far what I have said to you, there isn't one piece of theory in, there isn't one piece of opinion in, it is all pure fact. There's nothing to disagree with. I know, because Phil and I have spoken to mainstream economists, and generally speaking they give up arguing after a while and just go off and normally they have to agree we're right, especially when we start throwing quotes at them from Alan Greenspan. Or from Ben Bernanke. I have put on our Facebook page for this event a video of Warren Mosler, who I mentioned earlier, talking about modern money theory. And there's a couple of interviews, well, there's a couple of quotes on there. One of the Greenspan quotes, there's Greenspan actually saying it. And there's an excerpt from a television programme where Ben Bernanke was being interviewed back in 2009, discussing this, which was the more or less overnight doubling of the amount of government money in the US financial system. The interviewer said, is it tax money you're spending, buying up these financial assets from the banks, propping up the banking system? QE1 that was. We've had QE2 and QE3, and then they've been QEing perpetually ever since. Asked if it's tax money the Fed is spending, Bernanke said, you can look it up for yourself, you can watch the video, it's not tax money. The banks have accounts with the Fed, much the same way you have an account in a commercial bank. So to lend to a bank, we simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account they have with the Fed. Our financial system is just a massive spreadsheet. You'd only need a few $100s to have the software to run the whole financial system, basically. But that's all it is. It's just electronic items, electronic entries. You know, it's not gold. It's not something we have to dig up from somewhere. It's not something we can run out of. Our government can no more run out of money than the scorer at the Adelaide Oval can run out of runs during a cricket match. The Australian government cannot run out of Australian dollars. It doesn't spend tax money. That's not the purpose of taxation. That's not true. It doesn't matter whether it's him saying it or whoever's saying it. It's not true. It will never, ever, ever be true. Never. How could it be? He owns a big printing press, or rather we do, and he's kind of our chief executive, unfortunately, at the moment. That can't happen either. I mean, this is a bit out of date, obviously, but it could never happen. Then you've got Italy, Spain and Greece going off the edge. What do we know about Italy, Spain and Greece? They're not currency issuing monetary sovereigns. The only governments to face a debt crisis after the GFC were in the Eurozone. Japanese government, the American government, the British government. The British government was running a bigger budget deficit than Greece when Greece was in the middle of its problems as a share of its economy. The British government was issuing bonds, yes. as I was saying before, they were selling those bonds at virtually zero interest rates because everybody knew they couldn't run out of money. You can get hyperinflation. There's a $100 trillion note from Zimbabwe from 2008. There's something, goodness knows what that is, but it's from Germany in the early 1920s. But, excuse me for being a bit facetious, you have to sort of shoot most of your farmers to get the first of that problem. You have to destroy your productive capacity. That was the problem in Zimbabwe. Destroy your productive capacity, alienate most of the rest of the world and get sanctions put on you at the same time. Of course, food prices will skyrocket, and then if you print money to pay for non-existent things, then you get hyperinflation. And Germany? Well, if we were to start, well, I'm not saying they started, if we had a world war and we lost, and whoever won asked us for vast amounts of gold, and the only way we could possibly get this gold was to print lots of our own money. And the people we were giving that money to, where could they spend it? Only in our country. And if we just had a famine in our country and decimated our productive capacity, yes, you can get hyperinflation. But if that's the best you've got to throw at me, Zimbabwe in 2008 and Germany in 1923, it's not even worth dwelling on. Moreover, and I do need to go quickly now because I don't want to go on all night, and I've just communicated one important thing, which is our government can't run out of money. So you don't need to worry too much about a budget deficit, and in fact the government's nearly always had a budget deficit. There's something else I have to tell you too. The thing that's unsustainable is a budget surplus, not a budget deficit. It's the other way around. There is no such thing in a country like Australia as a sustainable budget surplus. I'm just about to show you why. The government budget, I'm about to say, can only move towards surplus if somebody else moves towards deficit. It's just the way the financial system works, or to put it another way, it's the way numbers work. The government budget can only move towards surplus if the private sector goes further into debt. In Australia, in recent years, this means more household debt. Households are not able to do this forever, and in fact hardly able to do it much beyond where we've got to now. If they do it for a while, it would go with the property bubble inflating again, and we'd end up with a worse crash, and we really would test how much reserves of capital the big Australian banks had if that happened. The Howard Costello surpluses were built on a mountain of dangerous household debt. Why is it the Labour Party can't point this out? The Greens should be pointing out, actually. The Howard Costello surpluses were the worst financial management that the Australian government perhaps has ever had, and I am including the 1970s. Because we've got a dangerous debt mountain. The debt mountain is the debt of people who don't own printing presses. There's something from Paul Krugman that I saw a few weeks ago on his blog, his New York Times blog. What we thought was normal. Paul is on the verge of modern money theory, but is reluctant to publicly go over. There are some modern money theorists who are friends of his. The same thing is true, by the way, of Joseph Stiglitz. They're on the edge. What we thought was normal actually depended on ever-growing household debt. More true here than even in the US. Didn't I show you who's the world champion of household debt? We are. Now, very quickly. For every borrower, there has to be a lender. Yes? I mean, there's various ways of explaining this. Phil would do it another way. Economists generally do it another way. I spent a lot of time training bankers who don't like equations so much as economists do, so this is the way I'm going to explain it. For every borrower, there is a lender. Every financial liability, well, that's a commitment, generally, that a borrower has to provide resources to the lender in the future, is also a financial asset. If I lend money to you, that loan is a financial asset for me, it's a financial liability for you. We're both in the private sector, so if we were talking about the whole private sector, it would net out, actually, in that case. Across our whole financial system, if you net everybody out, then borrowers and lenders have to cancel out. By definition, borrowing and lending, when you add it all up, if borrowing is a minus and lending is a plus, it has to come to naught. Not complicated. It's common to aggregate a bit. It's common to discuss three sectors. The private sector, which includes households and businesses. The government sector, which the numbers I'm going to look at in a minute, they don't match up to the earlier numbers because it means the whole government sector here. And the foreign sector, which is the rest of the world. Net lending on the Australian financial system, well, they could net borrow, but they don't. They can't all be in surplus at the same time. If the government overall is running a budget surplus, that means the government is a plus, the government's a net lender. Somebody else has to be a net borrower, it's just a fact. A chart. Now don't worry too much about this chart. You can see there's a horizontal line there at 0. Those three sectors I was just talking about, if one of the sectors, the foreign sector for Australia, is always above 0. If one of the sectors is above 0, it means they're running a budget surplus. The rest of the world, with Australia, every year for ages has run a budget surplus, which is another way of saying Australia has a current account deficit on its balance of payments and has for a very long time. It's kind of similar to a trade deficit. There's a tiny difference between the two, but you can think of it as a trade deficit. We import more from the rest of the world than we export. So the foreign sector is above the line. That means somebody else has to be below the line. By definition, it's the way the financial system works. Now, we usually like to see the government below the line because we usually like to see, and historically this has been the normal set of circumstances, we usually like to see the private sector a bit above the line. Because if the private sector is above the line, it's net saving. If the private sector is above the line, it's accumulating net financial assets over time. Its balance sheet's getting stronger. Our economy's not relying more and more on private debt. But look what happened. Look what happened during the Howard years. You see the green line going above 0? If I'd left out the other levels of government, it would be above 0 virtually all the time across the period we're looking at here. What had to happen in order for our government to run a budget surplus without our economy crashing so they wouldn't have been able to run a budget surplus? The private sector had to do the borrowing. Now, in fact, in order for us to be at or near full employment, what you have to understand is that our government cannot dictate the foreign sector budget surplus with Australia. That depends on whether the rest of the world wants to put money into our financial system or not. We can influence it, but we can't determine it. Not only that, our government cannot determine precisely what the private sector does. So if there's a financial crisis, the private sector gets more cautious, doesn't want to keep borrowing as much. The private sector will go from being in deficit to going in surplus, maybe. That's what happened. The inevitable consequence of that is that the government budget will go into deficit, where it should be most of the time anyway. There are two types of deficits you can have here. You can have a deficit that supports demand, supports employment, prevents a recession, or you can try austerity. You'll get a deficit anyway, but you'll get it because the economy implodes. But you'll end up with a deficit. If you're an economist, then you'll remember fondly that equation, which is another way of saying the same thing. I won't bother you with it now. Does it make it clearer if I put the rest of the world and the private sector together? The government budget balance and everybody else's budget balance is, by definition, the same, just with a plus becoming a minus. To a considerable extent, what happens to the government budget is determined outside the government. To the extent the government has discretion over its budget balance, it should normally be running a deficit, particularly in the case of Australia, given our relationship with the rest of the world. It'd be different if we were Norway, but we're not Norway. Given our relationship with the rest of the world, we have to, in Australia, have a budget deficit, more or less permanently, and generally speaking, significantly higher than it is at the moment, if we're going to have healthy private sector balance sheets. Another way of looking at the same thing, again, don't get befuddled by the chart, but what did I say earlier? When the government spends, it injects demand into the economy, it injects safe assets into the private sector, or more broadly the non-government sector, the private sector and the rest of the world. When the government taxes us, you can think of safe assets, dollars, demand leaking out of the private sector. Normally, the government will net spend, so there'll be a net injection into the non-government sector of the economy. This is necessary in order to support the economy if we are net importing from the rest of the world, because some of this demand is going to leak out. If the rest of the world wants to put money into our currency, it will drive our currency up to the point where we're running a trade deficit and we'll be faced with these net imports. And the private sector will, over time, want to net save. As the economy grows, as we have inflation, the private sector will want more safe financial assets. We need the government to supply it, these safe financial assets. A currency issuing sovereign government doesn't really run deficits at all. Instead, we're talking about net injections of demand into the economy and net financial assets for the private sector. It doesn't really run surpluses either. It weakens the private sector. Budget surpluses leak demand out of the economy, and they leak safe assets out of the private sector. This is almost completely misunderstood by nearly everybody. Well, a couple more charts. Can you see a relationship between the private sector line, which we'd like to be above zero, just as a general rule, and the general government balance? Can you see how disastrous the Howard Costello years were? We haven't dealt with the disaster yet. Just wait for the property market crash, if and when it comes. They want to try and do that again. It won't happen. Here's the US. I told you it's not just for Australia, it's every country. Look, the government surplus, that's the red line. Surplus, it's negative here, so it's a deficit. When has the Australian government budget, the American government budget, been in surplus? I haven't got the years at the bottom, but that bit there was actually Bill Clinton. It wasn't a good thing. Clinton wasn't a good president, not from the point of view of economics. The deregulation of the financial system that allowed the GFC happened under Bill Clinton's watch. Or to put it another way, when governments run budget surpluses, the private sector, but basically they have to deregulate the financial system. They have to go easy on credit. They have to encourage the private sector to go into debt. In the US, as here, and it tends to lead to, well, we had the collapse of the US stock market, then we had easy money again, and then we had the GFC. And that's when the private sector wants to save a lot more. So, of course, the government budget has to go into deficit. Governments, nearly always, nearly everywhere, run budget deficits. This is a good thing. It's not building up a burden for future generations. Now, at the beginning, what did I say about Treasury forecasts? This is what they were forecasting for the next few years. Before the budget, basically. After the budget, this is what they're forecasting. Therefore, the real pain is not supposed to hit for a while yet, till after the next election. And then a budget surplus of 2.3% of GDP by 10 years from now, and apparently growing forever? It's impossible. An economist would say it's not stock flow consistent. In other words, it makes implicit predictions about private sector balance sheets which are literally impossible. This is something to do with, as Phil mentioned at the beginning, problems with mainstream economics. Their models, the model the Treasury uses, is not stock flow consistent. It's why they always get the wrong answers. I haven't got time to explain it now, but believe me, this isn't going to happen. Even if they somehow get re-elected. It's not going to turn out like this. It couldn't do. We got 180% or so of our disposable income as household debt. It's not going to be 540% in another 10 years. We would need 500-year mortgages or something ridiculous like that. It's just not going to happen. It can't do. What we are not saying, we are not saying a government can spend without limit. Oh, I should have put that right. Phil told me about that one. Kind of we are, actually. We're not saying it's wise for a government to spend without limit. Of course not. You can even project, based on what we know about private sector balance sheets and all the other elements of policy, in order to achieve full employment. We believe in an employment guarantee scheme, me and Phil. We don't talk about now, maybe he'll talk about that on another occasion. But you can project what level of budget deficit you expect. We're not saying there shouldn't be a budget. We're just saying it should always be in deficit. We should forget this idea, or virtually always be in deficit. If you had a really amazing boom, which we're not going to have given the amount of private debt we have, it is possible to imagine circumstances under which you might run a surplus. Not likely, not in Australia. Governments have normally run deficits and will continue to do so. A monetary sovereign government faces no financial budget constraint. We don't need cuts at the moment. You might think some areas of the economy should have higher taxes. For redistributive reasons, yes, by all means. But because we need the higher taxes to pay for government spending, it's nonsense. Don't say it. Don't say it. Whichever party you're from. I haven't said anything which is a matter of opinion or theory yet. Anything at all. This would even apply if you were a convinced member of the Liberal Party. So far. It's just a series of facts. There is, for Australia, no such thing as a sustainable budget surplus. There is no budget emergency, except the one the government may be creating. A question, which you might have. Let me ask a question. Why don't the politicians and their advisors tell us the truth? Someone asked the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, Paul Samuelson, who lived to be very old, only died in 2009. He actually saw the GFC. When the GFC struck, he said, I wish Milton Friedman had lived long enough to see what was going to happen. Well, when he was asked, why don't we tell people the truth, Paul Samuelson said, well, what we tell people is like an old-fashioned religion. You can't trust the politicians. If they understood the freedom that they really have, they would abuse it. In other words, like an old-fashioned religion, the metaphors, messages which you're provided with are supposed to scare you. And of course they're in the interests of some groups in society as well, but they aren't the truth. And leading economists like Paul Samuelson, Paul Krugman, Joseph Stiglitz, these people, they know. Even the Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury under Bill Clinton, he knew that book. They know the truth. Now, Joseph Stiglitz, who I greatly admire, and Paul Krugman, who I also greatly admire, despite the fact he does like to have an argument with Steve Keen, somebody else I greatly admire, they occasionally, particularly in Paul Krugman's blog, and in some of the informal writings of Joseph Stiglitz, write like a modern monetary theorist. But they have so much to lose if they go across that dividing line. The ones I spoke about at the beginning, the weird deficit hawks. Robert Lucas has a Nobel Prize in economics. The Bank of Sweden awards them. It's full of deficit hawks. Edward Prescott has a Nobel Prize in economics. Robert Barro's the loopiest of them all. The centre or left in Australia, they'd be in the blue, most of them. Although Greg Mankiw was an advisor to President Bush, but apart from him. The neo-Keynesians, they're the ones, they go, like I was saying, yeah, maybe on average the government ought to balance its budget. They know governments don't have to, like I was just saying about Paul Samuelson. Sorry, I got his year of death wrong. But nonetheless, they're in the deficit doves camp. This comes from the Washington Post. There is a whole school of thought which you hear very little about in Australia, which is a great shame. It's because we haven't had a terrible crisis here, basically, so we haven't had to rethink. With some of the people I mentioned earlier, James Galbraith, Warren Mosler, Randall Wray, inspired by people like Hyman Minsky, who nobody'd heard of until the GFC and then everybody'd heard of. In Australia, we have one of the world's greatest economists, a neglected prophet, you might say. One of the people that developed modern monetary theory, Bill Mitchell, at the University of Newcastle, and a research body called Coffee. He runs a blog site called Billy Blog. You should look it up and follow it. He's brilliant. And the leading modern monetary theorist in South Australia is sitting over there. These are the deficit doves who understand what I've just been talking about. Now, I've spent too long going through all this stuff, so I won't say very much more. This was just a simulation saying that if Joe Hockey gets lucky, if they cut interest rates to zero and combine it with tightening the government budget, then maybe the private sector will go into more debt for a while and maybe the economy will pick up a bit more, but it won't last because of the growing debt burden. That's what I was going to say. This is the only slide with our opinions on. The government budget should be at whatever level it needs to be for us to have full employment. There's no reason why we can't have full employment, and in fact I think if what the Greens want, generally speaking, for the economy is going to work out, then eventually there'll have to be an employment guarantee scheme, a voluntary one, where people are properly paid and have proper working conditions, and there's been a lot of work done by Bill Mitchell on this. We tax and spend. This used to be described as functional finance, as necessary to limit inflation. We do things other than put interest rates up to try and discourage quite so much private sector, especially household debt. And the bottom part speaks for itself, really. That's the take-home message that I started with the important bit being the underlined bit at the bottom. Those are the books that I mentioned. Look up, if you're interested in these ideas, look up Warren Mosler and get this, it's about 60 pages long, get this book for free on the internet. He's a multi-millionaire, he doesn't mind giving his books away.
Can you just read the title?
It's called The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy. It's by Warren Mosler. You could just type in Warren Mosler, or just Mosler even, which is an easy name to remember, on Google. Or if you like, I'll send you these slides if you get in touch with me later. I'm quite happy to. That's it. Thank you very much.
I'm sure lots of you have questions, so if you do, please put up your hand and direct your questions either to Phil or to Steve. Are there any questions? Yes.
If, as you say, a sovereign issue of currency is an unlimited supply of funds, which obviously it has, how do countries accumulate foreign debt, or why?
Well, I mean, they don't. The Australian government doesn't have a limitless supply of US dollars or Japanese yen, but actually modern monetary theorists are, under nearly all circumstances, very much opposed to building up foreign debt. In the case of Australia, Australia has a negative net international investment position, that's what we call it, for the rest of the world, of about something like 60% of our GDP. But the net debt of the Australian government, the whole of the net debt of the Australian government, is only about 14% of GDP. So we do borrow from the rest of the world. We borrow in our own currency, or we hedge the foreign exchange risk, so that in the case of Australia, weirdly, if our currency gets weaker, we gain from that just because of the way in which it's structured at the moment. But the big borrowers are the big four banks, they're not the government. Why do countries borrow in foreign currency? If you're a developing country with a small economy, you don't really have much option than to do that. But it's something that we don't think is a good idea, large-scale foreign currency borrowing, because it compromises your monetary sovereignty. It compromises it in the sense that if you then spend if the government then spends more in order to try and bring about full employment and to provide all the public goods people need and the infrastructure people need, then it can put downward pressure on the currency. and putting downward pressure on your currency when you've got foreign currency denominated debt and you haven't hedged the currency risk on that debt makes it more and more burdensome to pay off that debt in the future, and that's where developing countries can get into foreign currency debt problems. There's no reason for Australia ever to be in that position. So.
We've got one over here.
What's your view of negative gearing?
It's a terrible idea. The politics of getting rid of it, there's a lot of terrible ideas that have been introduced in Australia down the years. To mention one that's controversial, and that people might throw up their hands in horror, the private superannuation system was a terrible idea. Why was it a terrible idea? It doesn't help providing goods and services for elderly people in the future. It doesn't help at all. The constraint when it comes to providing for the elderly in the future is to do with whether we have the infrastructure and the technology and the skills in order to provide what elderly people need. It doesn't matter who's spending the money. It doesn't matter whether it's the government spending the money or whether it's you spending what you think of as your money coming out of your superannuation fund. If the goods and services aren't there, we'll get inflation anyway. If they are there, it doesn't matter where the spending comes from. Why was it a bad idea? Partly, this is related to your question, because it created further impetus for an asset price bubble, as negative gearing does, but also partly because it's financialised our attitude to the elderly. We can have the sort of view that people had in traditional societies, where we're all in the same boat and we look after each other and we don't tolerate excessive inequality. But as soon as you move towards private superannuation, you change the frame of how people see the elderly, and inequality in old age becomes far more acceptable. Indeed, for young people, you get to the point where they can't see how there could be an alternative. But the idea that you need private superannuation and you need tax incentives to give people an incentive to provide for their old age themselves, and this is going to help the economy in the future in some way because it's going to prevent the government having to deal with that burden, is just a fallacy. It's not true.
And negative gearing?
Negative gearing, well, that just creates more of an incentive for upward pressure on property prices, which then, of course, drags mortgage debt up even further. And all the ways in which we've supported the housing market in Australia have put a bias into that market so that we have amongst the world's most expensive property at the moment. It goes with the world's highest household debt. You need only a small recession, a not particularly significant increase in interest rates, and the whole house of cards could come crashing down. I'm not forecasting when that will happen. Professor Steve Keen made such a forecast a few years ago and ended up having to do a forfeit. I think he had to walk to Mount Kosciuszko backwards or something. So I'm not going to do that, but nonetheless, it's a fact. We have an unsustainable system.
We've got a question.
So what do you think about charging our students at TAFE and secondary school and universities for their education when it's an investment?
I certainly don't think it's necessary to increase the level of fees that are paid at the moment. It would be politically, as much as anything else, difficult to scrap.
Excuse me, could you talk into the mic?
Sorry. It's probably obvious what my views are on that. It's unnecessary to increase the charges. Deregulation is potentially disastrous. It's got nothing to do with financial sustainability. It's got everything to do with privatising higher education.
Could we put the microphone over there so he doesn't have to get the bright light in his eyes?
Maybe I should just talk a bit louder. I can do that.
We've got a question over here.
I'd probably have to look at the slides again, but I gather two of the big problems that need to be kept under control are inflation and household debt. As far as inflation is concerned, you had J.K. Galbraith up there. I gather that Roosevelt made him his economic advisor in the times of was it the War or the Great Depression, and he was able to keep, well, mainly because of Galbraith, able to keep inflation in the US to zero. So that's the sort of good owl you want to have advising on monetary or on economic policy?
It wasn't actually J.K. Galbraith, it was his son, James Galbraith. There is a link. They're both. J.K. was slightly more famous than his son. His son is very famous, and in some ways associated with Joseph Stiglitz. He's very famous for work on inequality. He's almost as well known as his father was. As far as policies relating to inflation are concerned, it would probably be Phil who'd be better to answer that than me, because for modern monetary theorists, the employment guarantee and the wage paid to people who are participants in the employment guarantee is an important part of the way in which we propose to limit inflationary pressures.
We've got a question just
Yeah,
here.
it's also a big question. Also, do you feel in regards to inflation? Now, I was wondering, do you believe that we should have a slightly higher inflation rate? Because obviously Japan's got, I think, 0.025%.
No, there's no need to.
I was just wondering what your view is on the inflation rate, because obviously in America and Japan, the inflation rate's really dropped.
Yeah. The general view is that the inflation rate should be somewhere between about 2 and 3%, and that's a reasonable rate of inflation. There's no reason why adopting sort of the policies of that would be advocated by a modern monetary theorist should be inflationary. I mean, it's all about ensuring that whatever deficit spending is undertaken by a government, it doesn't push total spending within the economy beyond the productive capacity of the economy. That's all you have to do. Because as soon as total spending within the economy, and therefore I'm talking about private sector spending plus public sector spending, goes beyond the productive capacity of the economy, because you start to get inflation. The significance, the real significance here of the fact that the federal government has no budget constraint, has basically a bottomless pit of Australian dollars that it can access, is not that it should go on some wild spending spree. The significance is that if the federal government undertakes its policy agenda to achieve various social, economic and environmental policy goals, and one of them is to ensure full employment, and that requires total spending within the economy to always be at the potential output level, and the federal government's left with a budget deficit, it's irrelevant. It doesn't reduce its capacity to spend. So it's not about, federal government's got all this money, it should go on some ridiculous spending spree. Of course it shouldn't. It should never deficit spend to the level that takes total spending within the economy beyond the potential output level of the economy, because it'd just be inflationary. But it should always try and operate at that level. And if it's left with a deficit, so be it. Deficit will not reduce the capacity of the federal government to spend. Infinity minus X is infinity. A budget surplus doesn't increase its capacity to spend. Infinity plus X is infinity. That's the significance of it. It's not that it should just go nuts. There is a limit, because as much as the federal government can spend as much as it likes, it can't purchase as much as it likes, and there's a fundamental difference. There's only so much real stuff available for sale in the marketplace. Real resources, real labour, final goods and services for you and I and the federal government and state and local governments to purchase. And once that's all been spent, any further spending, whether it's our spending or deficit spending by a federal government, becomes inflationary. But as long as they're at that level, we're at the total spending within the economy is at that level, you don't have inflation, you can have full employment, and if the federal government is operating a budget deficit, in doing that, so be it. If it's got a surplus, so be it.
Are there any more questions? I've got one here.
Well, the federal government sets a budget yearly, but it can't predict what the private sector expenditure will be.
No, that's right.
So there could be, and generally speaking, government departments, once they've got the budget set, they've got to spend it. If they don't spend it, the government says, we'll claw back that money and we'll give you less next year. So government departments tend to spend what they're given. And that sort of runs counter to this.
Okay, so what the federal government, when it puts together a budget, the amount that it says it's going to spend is what it expects to spend. I mean, if there's more unemployment and they have to pay more dole payments, their spending can go up. Yep. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because they plan to spend a certain amount, that will be the amount that they spend.
Can I?
And as far as Well, yeah, I'll go on, Steve. I was just going to say, can I just say something else and then...
Yeah, go on.
But because Steve mentioned something about this job guarantee. And this job guarantee idea is that anyone who wants a job, who can't get a job in the private sector or in the conventional public sector, gets this job guarantee job that's made available by the federal government, because it's got as much money as it likes to purchase that labour and pay that labour, a minimum but livable wage. Now, the difference between this approach with the job guarantee and the old traditional 1950s, 60s pump priming, Keynesian pump priming, was that with Keynesian pump priming, the government had to sort of estimate how much it thought it had to spend to get total spending up to the potential output level. It could have been a bit less and it could have been a bit more, but with the job guarantee, it doesn't have to worry. Because if it's a little bit less, the total spending is a little bit less than potential output, then you'll have unemployment, and then when people...
Sorry, she had a question about what you just said.
It wasn't industry that work for the dole.
Would you like...
Well, hang on. With the dole you get... How much do you get paid for the dole? You get about $40,000 a year.
One difference is that it's optional.
Yeah, it's optional. You don't have to do it.
So you're not talking about taking somebody's alternative income support away, although you could do, but it's not part of it. Another difference is that the level of pay would be higher. Another difference is that you get the same... Well, we have this superannuation system. You get the same superannuation benefits and working conditions that anybody else would get. The idea is it's funded centrally, but it's administered locally. There's been a lot of research done on it. It's not just some idea coming out of nowhere. The other thing I wanted to say is that when you're setting macroeconomic policy, you need to be looking 2 or 3 years ahead. So nobody's talking about fine-tuning government spending from one year to the next. At the moment, it is true that when the interest rate tool isn't going to work anymore. At least it's not going to work to stimulate spending because it can't go below zero. So we've basically used that up now. It's gone, that approach to running policy. But interest rate decisions have always been taken with a medium-term view for demand in the economy, looking 2 or 3 years ahead. And there's anything that monetary policy can do in that context, fiscal policy can do as well. You can have, you were studying, I know you've been studying first year macroeconomics, you will have learned something called the Taylor rule, which is how you're supposed to set interest rates depending on the current level of inflation and what inflation is expected to be relative to some target. There's no particular reason why you couldn't have a so-called Taylor rule for the rate of growth of pure government spending, where pure government spending on infrastructure projects, that kind of thing, over the next 2 or 3 years could be projected to rise faster, when inflation was forecast to be towards the low end of your target range, and was slowed down when rising inflation was seen to be a problem. Monetary policy, they can change interest rates overnight, but interest rate decisions take a very long time to have their effect on the economy. And the idea that there is a bigger lag with fiscal policy than with monetary policy is not necessarily true. Anyway, sorry.
I'm just conscious of the time. Could we have just maybe 3 more questions? I saw someone put their hand up here who hasn't spoken. I'll come back to you if that's all right. We've got... Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. A big thing that's happened in recent decades is globalisation. And that gives the feeling there's a world economy. And then the default currency for a world economy is US dollars. So you get countries like Argentina borrowing hugely in US dollars, and then the sovereign country can go broke. So do we need to address the argument in terms of that perception of a global economy?
Argentina went broke because it foolishly chose to lock its currency in something called I've forgotten the name, a currency board system with the US dollar. So basically they decided at the end of the 1990s that 1 peso was going to equal 1 US dollar forever. When you do that, you are basically making the same decision Greece made. From then on, you can only borrow in foreign currency.
That's right.
So what I am saying is don't ever do that.
But it's happening, particularly from...
Not here. Well, it's happening, and as far as people like Bill Mitchell recently gave a talk at the European Commission, and I don't think they would have liked some of what he had to say, because what he'd basically say is demolish the Eurozone. You're not ever going to have a meaningful, powerful central government that can redistribute resources the way the Australian government can between states. The Eurozone doesn't work like that, and it's not going to work like that, so it's never going to work properly.
So if some countries are moving away from sovereign currencies, we need to have some direction for them.
Well, we can't. All I'm saying, I'm not trying to tell the Argentinian government what to do. I spend enough time worrying about what the Australian.
Was there someone else?
I just had a quick question.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, on what you've said, can a case be mounted in Parliament that the hockey budget has misled Parliament? I'm being a bit surprised at this sort of issue.
Only in the sense that every budget in Australia since Paul Keating, at least, has misled Parliament.
Including Paul Keating.
Yeah, including Paul Keating.
Yeah, we've got one over here.
Where do you see the employment opportunities for Australia moving forwards?
What areas? Or?
Yeah, do you mean in what areas?
Yeah, I mean, obviously manufacturing is going backwards. Where's the way forwards?
That's a difficult question for me to answer at this time of the evening. It's not something that I would claim to have expertise over. If we are going to have a successful economy in the future, we're certainly not going to achieve a successful economy without having decent physical, technological infrastructure, a well-trained and educated labour force. But we are not promoting, or at least that's not the purpose of what I've just been talking about, to promote a massive increase in government intervention, picking winners in the economy. All we are saying really is that you don't have to worry about government budget deficits. The government can't run out of money. If the government does have a set of industrial policies which it wants to pursue, then they may or may not be a good idea, but a shortage of money is not one of the issues. And the idea behind the employment guarantee is that the economy is a very complex system, unpredictable, uncertain, beyond our ability to control. So the employment guarantee scheme is really, the idea is to have a buffer stock of employed people rather than a buffer stock of unemployed people like we have at the moment. Nobody should be forced to be unemployed involuntarily or underemployed involuntarily. People can choose poverty, but nobody should have poverty forced upon them.
Sorry, just one more question over here.
If the government goes down this path, how do they know how much deficit to run each year?
Well, you'd be what they plan to do at the moment is not what they actually do anyway. So the government can forecast the budget position that it expects to arise, but like I was just saying, the economy is a very uncertain thing. We can't fine-tune the economy, and what actually happens may not be what they anticipate happening. If there's more people in the employment guarantee scheme and less tax being paid than had been anticipated, then the budget deficit will be bigger than forecast. If that happens, it's in no sense a failure. However, it's just something that's happened. It's not something to panic about.
In fact, the government really shouldn't think about the budget position at all. It's irrelevant. The government should be thinking about what it should be providing and acquiring the resources, therefore spending to provide it. The budget position then depends upon how much it ends up taxing the private sector, and that depends a lot upon the savings desires of the private sector. So it's not a case of, should we be aiming for a certain budget deficit? It should be thinking, well, we need to have these universities, these schools, these hospitals and so on. How much it ends up spending may have a lot to do with the level of private sector spending, because if there's insufficient private sector spending and you have people spilling out of private sector labour markets as unemployed, with a job guarantee system, they get employed by the federal government, and federal government spending goes up, and that might increase the size of the deficit, but so what? That's what's required to achieve full employment. But the size of the deficit is irrelevant. So it should be aiming about in terms of what it wants, what it should provide, what the people want.
So full employment's the target, really?
Full employment is one of the targets. You can achieve full employment in many ways, but you can have full employment by having people painting rocks, but that's not pretty effective. You really want, if you are taking on more people because people are spilling out of private sector labour markets, because of declining private sector spending, you want those people to be doing useful, productive things. And there's a list, you could write a list as long as your arm of the sorts of... In fact, the Centre of Full Employment and Equity, that's Coffee, where Professor Bill Mitchell works at, he's been advocating this job guarantee system. And of course, one of the questions he's been getting for a long period of time is, what are these people going to do? So what Bill did is he sent out questionnaires to some of the local councils in the Hunter region around Newcastle, and they got lists as long as you can imagine of all the things that councils could do if the resources were available. So there's plenty of projects that can be undertaken, useful projects. Okay, now the amount of projects that are undertaken will depend on how much private sector spending there is, because if there's more private sector spending, then there's more people employed in the private sector, so there's less available in the public sector. But you'll always have so much in the public sector because the public sector will be providing certain types of things, but there'll be additional things if there is lower private sector spending. So the amount of people employed by the public sector, you have the conventional public sector, then you have the job guarantee workers. So the amount that's employed in the public sector is going to go up and down as the employment in the private sector goes down and up.
Thank you, Phil.
That's right.
Could you please join me in thanking Associate Professor Phil Lorne and Stephen Hail for that.
So what did you think? How did you come to modern monetary theory? Let us know. Let us know if you have any questions. What did you think about the video that you just saw? One of the things that he said in the video that always strikes me the hardest is when he asks you, during the period of huge expansion, after World War II, the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, we were spending on all these programs. The debt was rising and rising and rising. Were you burdened? Were you burdened by the growth of the middle class? Were you burdened by the expansion of education? Were you burdened by all these things that came your way? Because we're always told that government spending, huge deficits, and the government debt is going to burden future generations. What burdens future generations is a lack of health care, is a lack of infrastructure, is a lack of education, is a lack of jobs, is a lack of real things. Those are burdens, not the national debt, not the deficit, not to a monetary sovereign. And it is critically important that we understand this, because they are still trying to lie to us, and we can't let them any longer. We'll see you next week.